Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Cassandra Snow. Cassandra is a Minneapolis-based tarot reader who has been practicing for over 10 years. Cassandra firmly believes that tarot and witchcraft should be accessible tools for anyone who wants to use them, and works to make them approachable without being fluffy. The work comes from a radical queer, sex-positive, fat-positive, anti-racist, feminist, and pagan point of view. Humor, generosity, and collaboration also weave their way through all of Cassandra's work. Today, Cassandra shares their story of growing up Baptist and then in college discovering witchcraft and tarot, which supported their own coming out. We also discuss Cassandra's book, Queering the Tarot, and the ways it helps bring a queer perspective back into divination. Lastly, Cassandra shares some of their favorite queer tarot decks. To connect for readings and teachings, visit Cassandra-Snow.com. Hi, Cassandra. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So, Cassandra, I would start out by having you share with us the story of how you first got interested in magic and tarot.
Yeah, I grew up mostly in the Bible Belt. We moved there when I was pretty young, so most of my formative life was in the Bible Belt. And so I grew up very Christian and very in the closet. I don't think this is true or needs to be true of everyone, but like I always kind of knew. And so it was always just like a secret. I was just like walking around feeling like super secretive all the time, which is not a great feeling. I also had a really traumatic upbringing, and it was actually not church related. I'm very blessed in that because that's not a lot of people's situation. My upbringing was just really tumultuous and dramatic. And I thought college was going to be a fresh, brand new start. And I went to college and I got really involved with all of the like good Christian groups you're supposed to get really involved in college. It was not a fresh start. I actually had a worse freshman year than I'd had probably my whole life. It was rough. And so that was just really disheartening. And I felt very like the services offered by the Christian organizations on campus were like re-traumatizing. It wasn't helpful or good at all. It was very victim blaming. I had one really bizarre trauma that like, it's almost like they didn't even believe me. They thought I was just making up a story or something. And so it was really, really hard. And I had met someone who is still my very best friend and favorite person in the world. We lived together in Minneapolis. And they had a similar sort of like bad upbringing, bad experiences with Christianity. And they started exploring witchcraft. And they were like, do you want to do this with me? And I just felt very like, well, why not about it? Like what I'm doing isn't working. And it was a specific faith within magic and paganism that I don't really follow anymore. I'm much more eclectic, but it definitely was a lot of the healing I was looking for. And it felt like it was grounding me and rooting me in a way that I had really never felt or experienced before. And then tarot actually happened a little sooner. We were a bunch of friends just goofing off and someone had a novelty deck. These were obviously not my Christian friends. These were my theater friends. And someone had like a novelty tarot deck. And I had never called myself psychic like publicly or anything, but one of my friends was like, Cassandra, you're psychic. You try this, and tossed the deck at me. And it really threw me. And I was like, I'm what? I think a lot of people going through really intense trauma, your first reading, even for yourself, is a hard one because it was a lot of like, there's so much you need to deal with, but also you're lying to yourself, you're lying to everyone else. I really believe that even some of the girls I was like secretly in love with showed up in the reading too. And it was like, why are you lying about this? So I obviously did not touch a deck again until I was further on my magical path. And, you know, me and my best friend, we just went all in. We were like, we're doing this. Yeah. And so that's sort of how I got into it. It's changed and grown a lot over the years. I got back into tarot really just because I was more comfortable with it. I was still in the closet, but I was like exploring a little. It was a more comfortable. It was like I just wasn't ready. There wasn't anything uncomfortable about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I got back in tarot and had a much better experience and was much more ready. But I also think I needed that initial reading because I don't think I would have tried magic. I think I would have just kept trying to repress everything. And instead it made everything kind of bubble up to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious because you said that you actually had a positive experience in the church that you grew up in.
Yeah.
And for a lot of queer people, some of the reason they turn to other spirituality is because they have a negative experience in the church. And I'm curious if when you started exploring magic and witchcraft, if you had any dilemma there because of maybe what you had heard in the church about, worshiping other gods or something like that.
I didn't really have a lot of hangups like that. So I was at a Baptist college and I was more worried about what is this going to do to my other friendships? What is this going to, because not everyone in those Christian organizations was bad. And I'll say my experience in church growing up was positive. We were very, very poor, and there were times we wouldn't have had anything if it weren't for the church. But my experiences in college with those Christian organizations was very negative. Not everyone was bad. And so I was very worried about what's this going to do to my actual friendships, the people that will stay up all night with me when I'm freaking out and having a mental break, So I was more worried about the relationships. Even when I was Christian, I have always felt whatever God or deity I believed in or was out there, I have always believed that shows up in whatever form it needs to for you. And so I just felt my spirituality was evolving or adapting, I think. And I was chill about that. I was just very panicked and I think I was worried about my reputation too, because it was a Baptist college.
And so then at what point did you start really tuning into the tarot and working with it more regularly and also as a way to make money too?
So sophomore year of college is when I started getting more into it. And then I just had been doing it for a long time. I think I took it more seriously after I came out of the closet, because before, when people wanted to talk about it with me, I would just get really uncomfortable. And I was because there was so much in the tarot that was confronting me about stuff. But I think after I came out of the closet, which I want to say was my junior year, it was very easy to then devote myself to tarot practice. And then when I moved, I transferred and finished school in Iowa, and I was a very devout pagan and tarot reader through all of that. And then moved to Minneapolis after graduation, where I've been for, I think this year will be 11 years, which feels wild to me. But I was just kind of playing around with my cards still for a couple years in. And then there's a writer, copywriter, blogger named Alex Franzen, who had never had a tarot reading and just wanted one done. And we were sort of friends of friends. We didn't really know each other. And I was in retrospect, it was certainly not a very professional reading. It wasn't great. I still had a lot of my notes, but I guess it was profound because she kind of grabbed my hand and was you should be more confident about this. This is what you should be doing. And it was really transformative for me. And so then I sort of broke up with the notes I'd been carrying around and sort of trying to gain confidence otherwise. Sort of had it as a minor side hustle. I was doing a lot of arts administration, and which is a field I still love. I just have too much anxiety to really be a part of it anymore beyond my own company. I had a really bad health scare several years ago, I think probably 6 years by now. And I also had to just kind of get out of regular full-time work. I was not a good employee, and it wasn't my fault, but I still just couldn't do it. It took me from side hustle to, I guess this is what I'm doing, really fast. And from there, I ended up getting hired at the Eye of Horus, which is staple in Minneapolis and has been for so long. And then I was so excited to see when the Future started here, which has sort of a national voice too in the conversation about feminist queer witchcraft and stuff like that.
Is that a store?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a store, but the store owner, Lacey, also has a lot of artist residencies and stuff. And so a lot of people from all over, including people who have multiple books or tarot decks published, have come and done projects and events there. And so I was really happy. I'd been teaching tarot there for a while, and she allowed me to have a spot in the store. I think I really didn't consider myself a professional until I got hired at the Eye of Horus, like 4 years ago. So I think I was like, oh yeah, I'm doing tarot cards till I figure out what I'm doing. And then I got an offer to audition at the Eye of Horus. And then it was like, I'll just go see if I can have like a tarot job. Like if that's and I lucked out, and I was even really upfront with them about my health and my anxiety and everything else. And they said they were really supportive. I was nervous about it, but that ended up being very true. And we're independent contractors, and they take that very seriously. So they're like, you're not beholden the way an employee is. And they've been wildly supportive. In my first book, I had a chunk where I specifically thanked them and Tracy, one of the store owners, because I really feel like so much of my life in tarot and magic is because of them. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer, but that's sort of where I ended up here. And now I'm like, this is what I'm doing, like no looking back.
So you say on your site that you describe your readings as radically honest, but never straying from compassion and empathy. I'm wondering if you have a specific reason why you put that, and maybe I can imagine that sometimes some readers are kind of like, ooh, like I see something here, but I'm not sure if this person is ready to hear that. So I'm just going to, dance around that. And if maybe you feel like it's really important to communicate what the cards are bringing up for this person, but also be compassionate about it.
It is. I also put that because I know every reader says they're non-judgmental. People have their judgments, they have their barriers. But when it comes to sexuality, sexual decisions we make, gender, and also like I have been poor most of my life, probably until the past year or so. And I understand the decisions you make when you don't know if you're going to survive. And so I put that I'm radically honest because I want people to understand that, like, if you're doing something and you're going to get caught, I'm going to tell you. But the compassion and empathy is like, I'm not going to, like, it's not that I don't care if you're doing that, but as long as you're not getting hurt, like, that's your business. And that's how a lot of my life is too. Like my close friends and stuff, I'm like, well, that's not a decision I would have made, but I'm not you. So that's one of the reasons I put it. I'm also just incredibly sex positive, and I do feel like a lot of readers, and I get it, it's society, it's not them, but they do get uncomfortable when we start talking about like the actual acts of sex and things like that. And so I was kind of looking for some language coding that would kind of work around that.
Yeah, I can see that. But I think that most queer people in general, because of the nature of our difference around sexuality, we're a lot more comfortable with it. And so I can see maybe cis hetero readers are like, ooh, I don't know about this. Like, I'm not supposed to be talking about it. That's their private life. And it's just like, you're reading their tarot. You're reading a lot about their private life. So why not just talk about what they're there to talk about?
Well, and I know when I get a reading, I feel so much more on display when like they're talking about my emotions than when they're talking about my like body or whatever. And so I think that's just a weird societal thing that is not anyone's fault, is what it is. Mm-hmm. But it is something that I have like actively worked to push through. And I think because of that, even though queer people are more comfortable talking about sex and sexuality, I do, so many of my clients, and even I struggle, like no one is perfectly over the hill most of the time. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of, I'm open talking about this, but the way I feel about it is still very complicated. And so that's something I have nothing but compassion and empathy for. But it also, like, when someone is very like out and proud, and like even if they are like very publicly very sexual, making a lot of jokes and things like that, sometimes the cards show that that's not really the reality in their head. And so I'm always more than happy to talk through that. The other reason I put that on my website is honestly, at the Eye of Horus and at the Future, I am very lucky. Every reader there is phenomenal. I'm so honored to be among those people. There's a lot of what I call love and light readers, and I don't mean that nastily, but they, even in my tarot classes, I see it all the time. People are like, oh, I can't connect with this card because I don't see anything good in it. And I'm like, well, sometimes there isn't. Like, sometimes that is the lesson and the challenge. And so I think even though we want to think that all tarot readers would dive in and tell you the truth, that's actually not as true as I want it to be. And then there's the flip side. There are also readers who, if they see something bad, they're just going to tell you so frankly that it like upsets people and pushes people away from readings. Mm-hmm. They like to be right more than they like to be helpful. And so I put that because it's like, well, my mindset is like, what is the most compassionate way I can deliver bad news that shows up?
Yeah. Well, what you just said really sticks with me. They like to be right rather than helpful. And I think that's really important for anyone who's being of service to people to really be aware of that bias that they might have in themselves, especially for a reader.
Absolutely.
So I also wanted to talk a little bit about your book, Queering the Tarot.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about your book, Queering the Tarot, and I thought I would just have you start out by sharing with the listeners a little bit of what it's about.
Yeah, it is a tarot book, by which I mean it is a book to read if you're learning tarot or want to connect with your cards more or know what each card's interpretation is. I like to think that it's a little more than that too. I put a lot of myself in it. It would have been easy to do a very straightforward book like this can be interpreted this way for queer people, but I don't know that I'm really capable of writing that impersonally, which is maybe a flaw in me. And that being said, my favorite tarot books are the ones where you get a taste of who the writer is and what they've been through and what the cards mean to them. And so I put a lot of that in the book as well. There's a lot of personal stories that are just used as examples. You know, the card doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to move halfway across the country in a burn it all down stage, but it's an example of what that can look like for a queer person. Weiser and I agreed that I should do a second book, this one about magic and witchcraft.
So one of the sentences, or I guess it's a question in the description of the book that I read is, at what point do archetypes become stereotypes? And I really liked that. And I was also thinking about, I think you had said that you actually started doing tarot before you came out and that tarot sort of helped you to come out. But I can also see the importance of writing this book because the tarot is in some ways mostly inherently fairly not queer.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you look at like the main card that talks about sexuality or relationship is the Lover's card, and it's almost always male, female, cisgendered, although there are probably other things that you could interpret in other cards to be queer. But I'm curious how the tarot helped you to come out, or if there were ways that maybe the tarot was speaking to you about writing this book to queer it up a little bit more for people.
Yeah. Well, when I was in the closet, most of the cards I were getting that kind of pushed me to come out were, you know, the Justice card or a lot of the Swords cards, which are about honesty and communication, even when it's painful. And they were cards about how basically like I wasn't going to be happy if I kept going down the path I was going down. Because of that, there wasn't actually a lot of sexuality in those initial readings. And then when I start, with the exception of like a lot of, you know, women would show up as like examples of where I wasn't being honest. When I started actually looking for it, I did run into a lot of problems. And then I started exploring, well, maybe I don't even identify as a woman. And then it got to the point where the tarot was helpful in the same ways it was always helpful, but there were definitely some barriers and there were definitely some things. And because I think one of the blessings of growing up poor is like, you just work with what you got, right? And so I spent a lot of time like, okay, well, how can I make the tarot work for me? And that's when I came up with a lot of those ideas and those realizations about the cards. And then when I was starting a writing career and wanting to take my tarot career more seriously, a local outlet called The Column was like, hey, do you just want to do like a card a month, see what happens? And that's where Queering the Tarot really started. And it got good feedback. It got picked up by Little Red Tarot overseas, which is another outlet that like literally changed my life. And I'm not being dramatic when I say that. You know, from there, the feedback was so strong, and Little Red Tarot at the time had such a community around it that like I was getting constant feedback on those articles, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but I needed those negative, you know, feedbacks. And so it helped me make a better book. Yeah. And I realized, you know, when it started picking up at Little Red, and it started like, you know, stuff started really floating all over the internet. People started finding me through that. I was like, wow, I really have something here. And then Weiser Publishing contacted me, and I thought it was a scam. Like, I knew Weiser was real. I have a bunch of books. This isn't how it works. Like, publishers don't contact you. But then it ended up, and kind of went along with it. I was like, well, let's just see what happens. I was like, I just won't give out my bank account number. Like, we'll just see what happens. But then it ended up being very real. And before I knew it, when I still wasn't sure if this was really happening, I had a contract and a deadline. And I was like, oh, great, we're doing this.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's really exciting to have a book like that and to bring queerness to something that has such history that might have some inherent queerness that might have been pushed underground by the patriarchy over history. So to have something like that to bring it out, I think is really great.
Yeah.
And you have a new book coming out in a similar vein, Queering the Craft.
Yeah, this one is called Queering Your Craft, and the subtitle is Witchcraft from the Margins. And I made that book. You know, a lot of my early writing, and I hope is early, I hope I keep going with this career, but is because I'm looking to fill voids. Like, there really wasn't an inclusive Queering the Tarot resource. Online, obviously there's tons of stuff. You know, it's all from specific identity perspective, but so much of my queer experience has been building community with like everyone who's like under this beautiful umbrella, and like how much more similarity than difference there is in what we're all going through internally and externally. And so I sort of came up with this witchcraft book in the same vein. There's a lot of gay witchcraft books out there, and there's some very good radical politic witchcraft books out there. But to me, those things are so much the same, like, to me. And so I wanted to make a book that was going to kind of cover as much territory as possible. And then, of course, that made it an incredibly nerve-wracking process, because, like, inevitably you can't include everything, and you can't include as much as, you know, I could have written an entire grimoire just of spells, and instead I only could really use like a third of the book for that. And then I could have written, you know, 2 more books in the same vein. But I'm really excited about it. I am a little nervous just because it is slightly out of my wheelhouse writing-wise. But I'm very excited. It definitely goes through similar to Queering the Tarot, it definitely goes through like the beginning steps, like what you need to know about the elements, what you need to know about Sabbats if you're going to do Sabbats. But like, you know, I try to queer it every step of the way. In the Sabbats, I not only talk about how to queer the existing ones, but I talk about like, it doesn't matter, just make your own magical timing. And I like give some examples. And I even talk about pride as like a Sabbat, and it being like, a lot of things we think of with Beltane, like a lot of debauchery and public displays of sexuality and brightness and everything else. And like, if that works better for you or as good, do that instead, or do both like I do.
Well, in most places, Pride falls around the summer solstice, which I think is fairly appropriate too.
Absolutely. And then I do try to go deeper where I can, because I want people who have always wanted a book like this, but maybe know quite a bit about magic to still like learn some new stuff or find out some new stuff.
Mm-hmm. So what would be some new things that people would find in that book?
There's just some really random tidbits. Like in doing all of my research, I'm blanking now, but I found out that on one of the Sabbats, weather divination used to actually be a huge thing. And like probably even now our Groundhog Day ritual comes from that. I want to say it's Ostara because that falls around the same time, but like little tidbits like that and like things you could include. And then I did a lot of research for what is basically just a list of names, which is like gods, goddesses, spirits that are either known for working with LGBTQ plus people, or you could work like they're people who like, you know, the outcasts, the, you know, people pushed to the fringes, things are like that. And so I even learned some, including gods that like I'd even worked with before. I don't remember if it got included in the book or not, but like there have been times throughout history where even Aphrodite has a specific like same-sex slant in some of her matchmaking and stuff like that. So I, you know, wanted to include a lot of that. I talk about the elements, and so I hope a lot of the ideas I bring up when I talk about earth. I talk about, sure, use stones, use herbs, but also don't forget that like our foreparents in this community used bricks and cement, and those are also from the earth. So even what's not new information might just be new ways of thinking about things and correspondences.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing that.
Thank you.
So, Cassandra, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
There's so many. Picking one is actually difficult. I talk about this a lot in Queering the Tarot and in Queering Your Craft. I think so many queer people, because of that shame I talked about earlier, need to learn to be in their bodies first and foremost. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if you don't like your body, even if you're experiencing a lot of gender dysphoria, which I do experience, so I know I'm not just pulling it out of my butt or whatever. You know, it's so important to get grounded and get in your body, because that's where your intuition and your power is going to come from. I say all of that to say breath work has been sort of life-changing, and I actually had a very difficult time connecting to like air magic or air energy, even though I'm a writer, but that always felt more creative or more cups or water oriented. But doing breath work has been sort of, I didn't even really, I've been practicing for years and years, and I never really like got anything from meditation until I started incorporating breath work. So I think that's the most recent practice that's been deeply healing and deeply rooting. And, I mentioned gender dysphoria before, and it's a weird time to be doing interviews because I'm questioning a lot of things right now. But I think even that breathwork practice that I've only picked up in the past 6 or 8 months has even allowed me to sit more comfortably with those questions that I've tried to kind of shove away for a long time.
Great. It's funny that you should mention breathwork, because I actually did a breathwork session online last night.
Oh, fun.
With someone who's starting to explore doing them online since they can't do in-person sessions right now. So
yeah. Well, and I think the first time I did it, I just walked away feeling like physically healthier. Like I was like, wow, I have been breathing wrong my whole life. But then over time that turned into more.
Yeah. So Cassandra, before I let you go, I'm curious if you have a favorite tarot deck that you think is particularly queer that people should check out.
I have so many, actually. I'll try to keep it brief, but I also don't want to leave anyone that I love out. So I'm only going to say I'll make it short by only saying the ones that are still in print, because I don't want to frustrate listeners.
Okay, that sounds good.
So there's the Next World Tarot by Christy C. Rode, who I'm a huge fan of. She's a queer artist, heavy metal artist, but she also made this like dystopian apocalyptic tarot deck that's super queer, and it used to have huge cards, and she just came out with like a pocket size, which I think is like a normal size. So that one is great. And then the Numinous Tarot by a buddy of mine who lives in Seattle named Noel. It's from a genderqueer ace perspective. I think it's so much more universal than a lot of my other decks. And then I just got, over the past since Christmas, I've gotten the This Might Hurt Tarot, which is, queer made, as well as it's like a very just updated Rider-Waite-Smith. Another Rider-Waite-Smith update that is the most affordable option I've brought up is the Modern Witch Tarot. That one is still, $22, $25 depending on where you get it. And it's like updated, mostly queer figures. It's great. And then I'll also say, even though I don't personally use this one, a deck I'm a huge fan of, I just don't connect with it, but a deck I'm a huge fan of is the Fountain Tarot, which is also queer made. I think it's still indie. I'm not 100% sure. I think of those decks I mentioned, the only one that might have an actual publisher behind them are the Modern Witch, and I think maybe the Next World Tarot does by now as well.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'll try to research those and put those on the show notes for people so they can find them.
Yeah.
So Cassandra, where can people find you and learn more about your work and get a reading?
So I'm just doing email readings right now. I don't actually thrive well doing video or phone, and I obviously can't see people in person. My website is Cassandra-Snow.com. And then I'm easy to find on Instagram, and as of now, I do answer direct messages, and my handle there is Tarot Cassandra. I also have a Patreon. A lot of the work I do now is more like teaching and helping other people learn tarot and witchcraft. And my Patreon is, I like to think, a good resource for that. And that's just patreon.com/Cassandra Snow.
Okay, great. Well, I will also have those links in the show notes and people can find them there.
Perfect. Thank you.
So Cassandra, thank you for being here and sharing more about your work.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Do you feel lost or stuck? Or are you alone on your healing journey? If you're seeking guidance or support, I'm here to help. I offer online coaching and counseling for queer spiritual folks from all over. Schedule your free consultation with me now by going to QueerHealingJourneys.com. I look forward to supporting you on your path. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.